are listening to the set list here on Irish City Radio, and that was the Arch Stanton Quartet, and that track is called Along for the Ride. And we're very happy to have one of the members of the Arch Stanton Quartet, Mr. Jim Ketterer, in the studio with me now. A very, very good morning to you.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Nice of you to come in. Just maybe start a little bit, sort of talk about you, how it came to be that you're a jazz drummer, right, with the Arch Stanton Quartet.
I am, yeah. Although I have to say on this particular cut, my friend Stephen Partika is on the kit. Okay. Because for a while after I had formed the band, I moved to Egypt, and while I was in Egypt, Stephen very ably filled in on the drum chair, as you can hear from this great cut. So I'm the child of musicians, and my father was a drummer, a jazz drummer, a classical percussionist, and played many other things and taught. My mom is a professional singer, so I grew up with music all around me. Mm-hmm. In fact, my parents met each other because they were friends with the people who had started a band back in the 60s that some people might still remember, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Right. And so it was really the Blood, Sweat, and Tears that not only brought them together, but I guess in some ways why I'm here now. Right,
excellent. And so did you start at a very young age then to start playing drums?
I did start playing around on them and soaking in all those influences of the music that I heard in the house and the musicians that were coming and going, playing around in my dad's drum set. And then I started studying formally third or fourth grade. And for a long time, I really focused on classical percussion. Learning the elements of how to play all the things that you see in the orchestra or a wind ensemble. So not just the drum set, but timpani and snare drum and all the other fun things back there in the back of the orchestra. And I spent a long time doing that. But as I got older, started to not only play on jazz ensemble in school, but also started to form some bands with my friends. Everything from jazz groups to funk groups to exceedingly loud rock bands.
Actually, it's funny you say that, because one of the questions I was going to ask you was that obviously as we grow up, and our parents have quite a big influence on what we listen to, certainly when we're very, very young. I know my dad did. And then as we become teenagers, we maybe rebel slightly and say, right, actually, no, I'm going to stop listening to that. I want to listen to my thing. So my question was going to be, whether you kind of drifted into different genres of music as well before.
I did. I mean, I did partially for that reason of rebellion. Mm-hmm. Partially, as a teenage kid, I figured my calculating way was probably an easier way to meet girls.
Right.
But also, I would say musically, looking back on it, I think it's really important, particularly as a drummer, where you have the opportunity to fit in lots of different kinds of music and different sorts of ensembles, to learn the vocabulary of each of those kinds of music, because it helps you be a better jazz drummer, it helps you be a better rock drummer, funk drummer, helps you be a better classical musician. So I think all those are not only fun and interesting, but are musically important.
Right, absolutely. So, and to bring it then back around to the Arch Stanton Quartet, how did that come to be? Did you know the members before from other bands, or how did you end up forming?
So I had met the guitarist Roger Noyes, who is also a very accomplished composer and author. He's just written a book. I knew him. He and I were in an Americana band, so a band that's somewhere between folk and country kind of music. Not a kind of music that I've played that much. And we were in this band together. And it was at a time when I didn't have a jazz project going at the time. And he and I just got to talking and thought, well, maybe we'll try to put something together. And there were a couple of other guys who I knew and had played with a bit. And I asked them, Chris Macchia on bass and Terry Gordon on trumpet. And in jazz, a lot of times you'll see groups that get together for a short amount of time, sometimes just for a night. We'll do a gig and we'll say, hey, we need a bass player, let's get that guy. We need a trumpet player, let's get that guy. I really like the idea of a band coming together, creating its own music, so not doing a lot of covers, but creating new music, and also developing its own sound, really developing a way to talk to each other musically and to get to know each other personally, because I think you end up making much better music together. And so this band has been together for several years. As I said, I went away for a few years to work overseas and came back, and the band was still together. I brought them to Egypt when I was there, and we've got a new album that we're working on now. And I think you can see a development of the sound of the band, of the compositions of the band, and the way that we interact musically. So I think you can see that you see that in a lot of rock groups. You don't see it as much in jazz.
Right.
So and when we started the band, we really felt very seriously that it wasn't going to be, the Jim Ketterer quartet or the Roger Noyes quartet, and so we thought long and hard about what should we name the band. And naming a band is never an easy thing, no matter what kind of band it is. And it's harder when it's a jazz band, because if you give it something that's a little too interesting or a little too strange, a lot of club owners will think, well, you're not really a jazz band.
Right.
So Roger had the idea that we should name it after Arch Stanton. So there's nobody in the band named Arch Stanton. It happens to be from the movie, the old Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it's the name on the grave at the end of the movie next to where the money is buried. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen the movie. But so there's been many times where people have come up to us and asked, which one's Arch? Who's Arch? Can I talk to Arch?
Excellent. And did you guys have similar tastes then in music and influences that you wanted to explore with the band?
I mean, similar enough, but also different enough.
Right.
And we all play with other projects and lots of different kinds of music as well. But we also, we come together with kind of a common understanding of the kind of music we want to play together. And so when we're rehearsing or getting ready for a recording, we're sorting some things out musically, and I think a lot of it really ends up happening on the bandstand as we're playing these songs out for the public, because it's really the interaction with people who come to hear us, I think, that ends up informing us about what's working and what's not working. We really want to connect with people when we play. I think every musician does at some level, but jazz, I think, unfortunately, has gotten this reputation of being a bit too esoteric and a bit too at a remove from the audience. And we want to reconnect with people. We want to convince people who think they don't like jazz or they don't know enough about jazz to appreciate it that they should just come and hear the music and enjoy it.
Yeah.
And if there are things they like, we're happy if they cheer and hoot and holler. And if they don't like it, they can tell us that too. But we really appreciate the feedback and the interest. And you can tell when you're playing if people are paying attention and they're into it.
Yeah. Is your do you prefer the recording process or the live? I mean, I imagine it's playing live, but...
Yeah, I mean, playing live, particularly in jazz, I think is so important, because basically the band is having a musical conversation.
Yeah.
And we're inviting people to listen in on that conversation, and in the way that I just described, really to be part of the conversation. As we interact with them and they with us, they change the conversation that we're having musically. So I think that's very important. I also think that the music industry has changed. It used to be a generation or two ago that people would tour in order to promote an album that they had recorded. Now they put out an album to promote touring.
Yeah.
And I think that's no different for jazz than other kinds of bands as well.
Yeah. So how much, when you are playing live, obviously you've got the tracks that each song, how much improvisation is there during the live shows?
So it really depends on the song itself. There are some songs that are fairly charted out, We are working for our new album. We're going to be including a suite of music that was written inspired by the famous American novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And a lot of that music all the music was written by Roger Noyes. And we've performed it sometimes with some readings and some explanations of the music and the novel. And that music is a bit more orchestrated, although there is improvisation. A lot of the other songs are traditional jazz in that the melody is played, and then after the melody is played, each member of the band takes a turn and solos over the basic foundation of that song. And everyone else is interacting as they're saying their piece, and then it's somebody else's turn to do the same. So that's the improvisatory part. But it's a balance between having a common understanding of how the song is constructed and what kinds of things we're going to do in those conversations, and then letting people take it where it might go. I mean, there's some songs that we play, particularly songs written by our trumpet player Terry Gordon, where there will be fewer notes written, and there'll just be instructions in certain sections. Things like he'll write, "Take no prisoners," or "Let it rip," or there'll be a very basic melody at the beginning, and it can go in any number of directions. And so the song is truly very, very different every time we play it.
Right. And when you are playing live, and if one of you is kind of going off, really on it. Are you ever thinking like, wow, where's he going with this? Am I gonna bring this back, so to speak?
Yeah, there are those moments.
Yeah.
And but I think it's like having any sort of conversation. You can be chatting with a friend or someone that you've just met, and at some point it feels like the conversation is kind of veering off in some direction that you just hadn't anticipated, and while that can sometimes be kind of a distraction or a dead end to the conversation, a lot of times it leads you in new directions that you hadn't anticipated, and you've come up with something completely new. I mean, I played a gig with the quartet just before I came here to Luxembourg, so 2 weeks ago, and the bass player and I were doing something different on a song that we've played together many, many times, and at the end of the set, we both went over to each other and we said, "Wow, that was great." I mean, we surprised each other in the direction that it was going. So, we try to minimize the number of times that the surprises are unpleasant surprises or turns into a train wreck, and hopefully we end up going down new avenues that are interesting for us. And I think if it's interesting for us and we're having fun on stage and we're into it, that's contagious, and then the people in the audience also pick up on that.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I definitely have an interest in jazz, and it's definitely developed over the years. I certainly wouldn't proclaim to know a lot about jazz, but I'm always open to discovering new styles of jazz, and I'm very open to it. And as I said off air before, we do the Jazzy Gem on air every day here. We play one or two kind of select tracks from different artists and so forth. But just to sort of bring it back sort of to Luxembourg now, you mentioned that you've been over here for 2 weeks. What's actually been the purpose of your trip over here then?
So I initially came to participate last week in the Transatlantic Dialogue, which is hosted every 3 years by the University of Luxembourg, is overseen by François Carbon, very ably overseen by him and pulled together. And this year they had about 300 people from the U.S., various universities from across Europe, artists, scholars, diplomats, to address the ways in which cultural diplomacy can serve as bridges between cultures and among cultures, I would say. And there were lots of interesting panels, lots of interesting conversations, and as I think often happens in conferences that are really going well, lots of interesting conversations off to the side as well, over coffee, over dinner, etc. I was honored to be able to be the American observer to a day-long meeting of the European Cultural Parliament, and then to kind of help sum that up at the end of the conference. And the sorts of issues that artists in Europe are concerned about and we're talking about in that meeting are very similar to the sorts of things that American artists are also thinking about. The challenges and opportunities that technology presents to artists. Funding issues. It's always an issue for artists of any sort. Not only where does the funding come from, but what strings might it come with? Questions of criticism. Not only professional critics who write in the standard newspapers, but blogs, Twitter, whatever. It's a wild world out there of criticism, and how does that affect the way that artists do what they do? And who is the judge of quality or lack of quality? I'm always a little flexible on more than a little flexible on that question. I think when Duke Ellington says if it sounds good, it is good. That's enough. And if you read something in the newspaper and a critic doesn't like a concert that you went to and you thought was very good, I would go with your gut and say, I liked it. Yeah. This person may not have, and they had some interesting insights, perhaps. But I think tastes. people need to kind of trust their intuition on these sorts of things. But the dialogue was a really interesting opportunity to get to know people at the University of Luxembourg, where there's a lot of fascinating things going on, and so the U.S. Embassy brought me over here to participate in that. I gave a presentation on the use of jazz in diplomacy and the role that people like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie played in representing the U.S. During the height of the Cold War, but also during the height of the American civil rights struggle. And that tension between how they presented the U.S. Through jazz, and jazz as a democratic art form, at the same time that they themselves were facing, very sort of the blunt end of racism back in the U.S. And so had a fascinating series of conversations with people down in Belleville at the Transatlantic Dialogue about that. But I also took the opportunity my last day of last week to go out to the jazz festival in Dudelange and heard some great music.
Right, excellent. So it seems like you've managed to fit in quite a lot whilst you've been here. You've enjoyed your time here?
Very much, yeah. It's a great place. I've met some wonderful people, some interesting musicians. I just would urge, your listeners to get out and support local music venues. Jazz night at Liquid here in Luxembourg City. I heard a great duo last night that was visiting from France, I think, and had a great conversation with Ben Conan, who's a very accomplished jazz vibraphonist. He studied in the U.S., but he's here working on a lot of fascinating projects.
Excellent. And what were the actual kind of what did you come away with from the Transatlantic Dialogue? Like sort of key things that stuck out for you from the dialogue that you had?
Well, as I said, in terms of the role of artists, I think that there's a lot more in common than not, and so that's always a good place to start and something to build upon. But I think we have to be honest and say that we live in tension-filled times where the politics of the moment are in the headlines, and they affect culture as much as, and culture represents those tensions. In addition, those other things that I mentioned, like the questions of technology, these are really a manifestation of globalization, which in the early 90s we were initially thinking was going to be kind of an easy way to transcend cultures, to transcend borders. But it's turned out to present lots of challenges as well, economic challenges, political challenges, and I think cultural challenges. How can we bridge cultures and share cultures, say in my field in music, and at the same time still retain a sense of a local uniqueness? How, what is specifically European in the approach to jazz, let's say? What's specifically American? What's African, etc.? If everything just kind of gets leveled out and there's a sameness to it, I think not only is there a lot lost musically, but I think it leaves a lot of people feeling very unnerved by the direction of things, and that has both cultural and political consequences to it. So that was certainly on people's minds, and they were having open, honest, and I think productive conversations about it at the Transatlantic Dialogue.
Fascinating. Listen, we're going to go over to the local news now because it is 11:30. But nice to talk just a little bit more with you, perhaps after that, if you're happy to stick around just a little bit longer.
Love to.
We'll put some local news on also, and then we'll follow that with another track by the Arch Stanton Quartet, and we'll have a little bit more of a chat with James Ketterer after this. Right then, we are, what are we? We are 22 minutes before 12 o'clock. This is ARA City Radio. And that is the Arch Stanton Quartet. That track is called Zamalek. And we have Jim Ketterer in the studio with us. We were talking to him for the last half an hour, a lot about his band, what he's been doing in Luxembourg with the Transatlantic Dialogue. Just want a few last little questions for you before you head off is... what you're doing when you're not in the band, you teach music, right?
So I don't teach music.
Okay, sorry.
It's almost completely different, but
okay.
there are connections. So
yeah.
I teach political science and Middle East studies, and I teach a course on diplomacy. And I'm also the Dean of International Studies at Bard College in New York State. So I oversee all of Bard's international programs, the programs that allow our students to study overseas, but also programs that allow students from other places to come to the U.S. And to study with us. And in addition to that, I run the Bard Globalization International Affairs program, which is located in New York City. Our main campus is about 2 hours north of New York City in the beautiful Hudson Valley region. But we have this center in New York City where students can come for a semester and take courses from scholar practitioners, leading people in the world, and also do internships in international affairs. So at places like the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc. And then live in New York City and experience all the city has to offer, everything from music and culture to anything that might come up just walking around the streets of the city.
Yeah, great city as well. So much going on.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's never a dull moment.
Yeah, nice. And so do you find also that a lot of the students then that you come across, I guess a lot of international students, as you say, have you come across any sort of potential jazz musicians from what you were talking before about how you get influences from different parts of the world? Have you met anyone that's been particularly good jazz musician that happens to be studying?
Oh, at Bard?
Yeah.
Well, Bard has a music conservatory. I should have mentioned that. And many of those musicians are focused on classical music,
Okay.
but there are also great jazz musicians who are there as faculty members and students who are there to study jazz and to do jazz composition. And there's some fantastic musicians. And there are some great musicians throughout the years who have gone to Bard and gone on to big things. The two guys in Steely Dan went to Bard. The song My Old School is about Bard.
Okay.
And some of their other early songs reference Bard. Members of the Beastie Boys went to Bard.
Yeah.
So it has, in addition to that, and perhaps in a different vein, the president of Bard College, Leon Botstein, who's been there for 40 years, the longest-serving president of a college in the United States, is a musician, is the conductor and the musical director of the American Symphony Orchestra, which is based at Carnegie Hall in New York City. So it's a place that takes music seriously, music in all its forms, and it tends to attract students, even if they're not musicians, students who do also take it seriously and appreciate it.
Yeah, nice. And so you're, as you say, you obviously have the band and you play live a lot around New York City, I guess, as well. If people happen to be in the New York area, are you playing a lot of live shows as well?
So we're based in what we call upstate New York, north of New York City. I live in the capital of New York State, Albany, and all the band members live within striking distance of that city. So a lot of our shows have been there. We have some shows coming up there's a summer resort town north of there called Saratoga Springs, and we play in a place called Nine Maple, which is quite a well-known jazz club. And we have some performances coming up there, and we have some other performances coming up in Albany. And if people go to archstantonjazz.com, they can find out where we're playing, or they can also find us on Facebook.
I was going to ask you.
And I'm hopeful that in the not-too-distant future, they can find us playing here in Luxembourg if things go well.
Nice. Excellent. Have you got any plans for new material in the future, new album or anything like that in the pipeline?
Yeah, there is a new album in the pipeline. We're bringing together the music. As I mentioned before, our guitarist, Roger Noyes, has composed a suite of music based on the novel Invisible Man. So we're going to do that suite of music and put in some other songs and anticipate that the album will come out probably mid-autumn.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to that, and I hope we get to hear it and get a copy in the studio that we can play. That would be superb. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure.
Talking to you, Mr. Jim Ketterer. And we're going to play a little bit more of this particular track, which you mentioned to us from the album. I should give the album name as well. This is Along for the Ride. No, it's not. It's the other one. What have I done with the box? Here it is. Blues for Jolie?
Soli.
Soli.
So Soli was the name of the bus driver who drove the band around Egypt on their week-long tour.
Right.
He was quite a character, and he and the band, we all got along very, very well. And so the album, in many ways, is trying to kind of capture his humor and spirit.
Superb. Excellent. Well, I look forward to checking a bit more of this particular album out. It's been a pleasure. We're going to finish with a track that you actually requested by an artist I'd have to confess I hadn't heard of before, K.J. Dennett, and the track Little Problems. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your stay in Luxembourg.
Thanks.
Everybody needs a little problem sometimes, if only to get up in the morning and fight for your right. You run not to be holy. I could find a better pill, some inspiration and crime from one thing to make the details of war. I wish I could fly like a bird on the wing. All I would do is sing about should do it. Give it to me rhapsody, good like keep it grooving. You see all the cards are stacked up, and my mother's on the phone. She says there ain't no use in dreaming, girl. It's not a dream anymore. Setting up my tab, I got to keep on moving. I've been down this road enough to know no one's gonna save me just 'cause I'm behaving. I was the first online, I was be the very first to go, 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 go. Oh, la 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 la. Oh, everybody needs a little problem sometimes. If only to have a turn to tell you touchy tales of war. I wish I could fly like a bird on the wing. All I would do is sing about should do it. Give it to the real say, good like keep it grooving. You see all the cards are stacked up, and my mother's on the phone. She says there ain't no use in dreaming, girl. It's not a dream anymore. Sail on my tab, I got to keep on moving. I've been down this road enough to know no one's gonna save me just 'cause I'm behaving. No one's gonna save me just 'cause I'm behaving. No one's gonna save me just 'cause I'm behaving. I was the first online, I will be the first to go.
That was KJ Dennett and a track called Little Problems. And many, many thanks to Jim Ketterer for coming in and talking to us about his band and also stuff that he's been doing in Luxembourg. The band, if you didn't catch it, called the Arch Stanton Quartet. That's the Arch Stanton Quartet. And yeah, really, really interesting, I thought. Right, 10 minutes of the show to go before we hand over to Tasha at 12 o'clock. So let's get some music in as quickly as we can. This is Danger Mouse featuring